This episode was originally a live conversation streamed on January 2022. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell to receive notifications for future live streams.
You need to have patterns, repeatable patterns that you can demonstrate, because essentially people buy a projection into the future, and they don't buy a fantasy, they buy a projection.
Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. Here's your host, Sylvan.
Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to today's live session. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Heiner Grüter. Heiner, a very well welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation, Sylvan.
You are the CEO at Meridian Partners, a strategy and M&A consultant. And in the past, you've actually also been the CEO at UNIC, for example, one of our identified startup mafias. So I first want to talk about this topic real quick before we dive into the M&A world. What was so special about UNIC that gave rise to so many new companies over time?
I think probably first of all, it's a matter of timing. So UNIC was one of the early movers in this digital agency space in Switzerland, and one of the bigger ones. So I think naturally people have been, within the space very early on. They've seen the boom and bust, and through that obviously gained some significant experience about what works and what doesn't work. I think a second aspect is the company was successful because it had very talented people. So that's always a good source for successful entrepreneurial ventures. And the third one was related to the timing. When you're building your company as an early mover, you know yourself, you need a very entrepreneurial spirit. And I think that's probably been the three main drivers when I think about it, why there's been quite a few companies coming out of the UNIC universe.
Yeah, it certainly is a very interesting and fascinating environment that you built there. And if we look at your track record, it's incredible to see what M&A deals like Students.ch, Qumram, Infocentric, WebTeaser, and many more that you actually led as a deal captain, so to speak. So if you want to start with the M&A topic, the focus of today's session, what are the right reasons to sell your company? And maybe also what are the wrong reasons to sell your company?
I think it's important to understand essentially that if you sell your company, you're basically in the context of believing that somebody else is a better owner for your company than the current shareholders, or the future management team would do a better job. And having said that, I think it's not, there's no black and white about good reasons and bad reasons, but obviously if there is a clear integration case in terms of creating synergies in a bigger context, for instance, or having access to bigger clients, etc., is probably a better reason than I'm tired of doing this and I want somebody else to take my job. But at the end of the day, I think the reason why you want to sell, and there's literally a ton of reasons why this could happen, also determines what you can expect from such a process. So, if you're a strong synergy case with a lot of potential buyers, you obviously can expect more interest, higher valuation than if you look at the other side of the scale, sort of a fire sale situation where you just look for somebody who takes over your problem.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense if you think about it. And when you were talking about, sort of the story and also why you can actually sell a company if there's a better owner for it, there's a quote I'm paraphrasing here from Peter Thiel that comes to mind. He once said that when you sell a company, the price is usually never right. It's either too high or too low, because if you have a great idea about where you want to bring the company, you probably sell for too little. But if you don't have any good ideas and the company's probably not worth that much, then you probably sell for too high. What do you think about that statement? Would you agree with that, or is it a bit too far from reality?
It's always a bit hard to disagree with Peter Thiel if you look at his track record. So I would say that's probably true. On the other hand, I think, and that's probably going to be a topic that we'll touch upon in various instances as we go through your questions. At the end of the day, it's always one of the most important aspects here is really timing. And you can always look back and, ask yourself what would have happened if, and should we have done this? And essentially, I think if you're well prepared and if you execute professionally, you can most of the times assume that whatever comes out of such a process is actually the right price. That's how I see it.
No.
And if you totally convinced that whatever came out of a process is not going to satisfy your expectations, there's always a plan A, not to sell.
So I want to talk about the timing and also the preparation that you have to do in a second. Just before we do so, a quick note to everybody watching. If you have any questions for Heiner, feel free to leave a comment so we can also address your questions and your topics around that M&A topic in our live session today. So Heiner, you mentioned the importance of timing. So ask very bluntly, when is the right time to actually sell your company? Is there such thing as a right timing?
I think there's certainly drivers you can look at to determine whether timing is better or not so good. And I would think of that in terms of internal drivers and external drivers. So let's start with the simpler one, the external drivers. You look at the market, we'll see how 22 turns out, but 21 was certainly a good year. The last years were good. Companies are buying other companies. There's a lot of activity. The overall constitution of the economy, despite some of the irritations that we have, is still very solid. So if you look at the broader economy, and obviously also your specific industry, there's cycles when things look brighter and times when things don't look that bright. That's the external part. So I think there's nothing wrong about having an eye on that. And the second part, which is I think probably more important, is internal factors. And then there's always an opportunity to be too early or too late. I think you need to, in order to be able to enter such a process, you need to fulfill some criteria. And it's not a mathematical game, but it's something that you can feel. And if you have discussions with people that have done it or some experts in the field, they can help you determine whether you're too early or too late. Some of the aspects are you need enough track record. It's totally hopeless to go out there and having basically no track record, no KPIs, no company history, and then expecting people to believe your projections, which are basically just made up. We should not forget, M&A is not the same as a financing round. In a financing round, that's totally okay. People would only invest in your company if they believe that they can get a 10x or 20x out of a process anyway. So the details don't really matter, I would say. In an M&A context, it's a totally different ball game. So track record is important. On the other side, you also have to make sure that you still have enough fantasy and upside potential that you believe you can achieve with your company. So if you're basically exhausted, if you run out of growth ideas, it's too late to then go to the market. And then there's obviously some other aspects, operational stability, positive momentum, etc.
You mentioned the importance of, having something to show, some KPIs, some track record. Are there any certain numbers where you say, hey, below these numbers, it doesn't make even sense to think about an M&A or exit strategy because it's way too early? Is there such a threshold?
It really depends on the industry. I think it also depends a little bit on the basically strategic rationale. So, if you want to measure that by revenue or profitability, I think it's not possible. There's certain rules of thumb, like if you're a SaaS business and you want to sell to a US company, don't go there if you're below 5 million ARR. But those are rules of thumb, and
Right.
I don't think they're applicable in any specific case. I would say what's important is you need to have patterns, repeatable patterns that you can demonstrate, because essentially people buy a projection into the future, and they don't buy a fantasy, they buy a projection. And that's a clear distinction. So you need, when I say track record, I mean not only numbers, but also relationships, simple things like we make 15 calls and sell one piece of software.
Yeah.
If you have some consistency, then you have some predictability. Critical size is certainly also a topic, but that's hard to measure in clear numbers. I think what's also very important, people should not forget, is the sheer fact of secured funding. So sometimes I see situations where people say, we'll run out of cash 6 months from now, so maybe we should better sell. That's bad timing. You need to make sure, whether it's through financing rounds or company already being profitable, that you don't run out of cash during the process, because just put you under time pressure, something you really want to avoid.
Then, you mentioned one thing, that you have to have that predictability, so to also add value to the company that might eventually buy you. So what are the different options that I can choose from for my M&A strategy? Or ask differently, what are the reasons why a different company, another company, should buy my company?
It's really, you have a whole set of motifs. It can go from let's say, in an extreme case, pure IP situation. You have developed something that's just very important, know-how, protectable IP. Company has no revenue, has no profitability. Something, a typical case you would see in the biotech space, for instance, in Switzerland. On the other hand, you see, in a much more mature case, it really boils down to numbers and synergies, and how much cost synergies do we get, etc., etc. I think, as a general rule, it's important in the situation to really put yourself in the shoes of the potential buyer. I think one mistake to avoid is to project your thinking too much into the buyer's mind. Of course, you have to think about, what would they do with our company? How could they create additional value? But I think it's also, there's a danger to draw premature conclusions about that. And I think in the process, in an M&A process, one of the challenges is to balance sort of telling a story and leaving enough room for some fantasy for potential buyers to come up with their own reasoning behind an acquisition.
Yeah, that sounds like a not so easy balance to strike.
That is, in fact, not that easy. But when you think about the sort of the core elements, what you're doing in presenting, at least in an initial phase, before you probably get into deeper conversations with potential buyers, it's really about facts and figures. It's not. There's a substantial marketing part to an M&A process, no question about it. But people should not be naive. At the end of the day, it really boils down to facts and figures, and those are what they are. And you can always, be a bit more intelligent or creative about what KPIs, for instance, to show, what to leave out. But I think that the best thing to do is to really, again, put yourself in the shoes of a potential buyer. Beauty is always in the eyes of the beholder. And, nobody's perfect. And even if some of the figures you show are not that great, if you have an explanation for that, I think it adds credibility to your story.
No. I also want to pause here and answer some questions that we already got from the audience. So here one I think that is a good fit for the topic we're talking about right now is from Maximilian. He asks, from experience, for a startup willing to be sold, would you recommend to try to get a deal while growth momentum is high but with limited revenues? Or would it be worth waiting to increase revenues to a certain point but taking the risk of the growth slowing down?
I think if it comes down to the timing aspect that we have touched upon. I think if you don't have any momentum, you don't have a customer base that's big enough so you can draw some conclusions from it. It's just too early. So I think if you're, anybody can go to the market and say, yesterday we had one client, today we have two, so we double our clients every day. This is unfortunately not how buyers think. So I would try to get some critical size before I go to the market, even if your growth is slowing down a little bit.
I think this is also very interesting. So due to privacy reasons, you can't see. It's from Mark Schuster. He's with UiPath, a very interesting SaaS startup. How do you see Switzerland compared to Europe startups in terms of M&A for SaaS companies? And also, what sector do you see most growing? I think that's a really interesting sort of macro perspective to get your thoughts on.
If you look at the dynamics in Switzerland, it's just pretty breathtaking. I've been in the startup ecosystem for decades now. Unfortunately, I have to say decades. And the development the market has taken in terms of financing facilities, in terms of teams, I think it's pretty amazing. And one thing that I always thought was a bit sad about Switzerland was that a lot of the startups that I had seen or smaller companies, their focus was really on the Swiss market, maybe Germany, but they never had sort of a more, at least European footprint in mind. So I think Switzerland is really catching up. I think Germany is probably still a bit ahead, but also if you see the quality of teams, people with experience, people that have failed and tried again, which is always, nobody wants to fail, but it certainly, there's steep learning curves involved in that. So I think that Switzerland is more and more becoming an interesting place also for M&A. Now, in terms of SaaS startups, which the user is asking here specifically, I think the great thing here is you don't really need a local presence. SaaS is typically sold or more and more sold remotely. So I think it's actually Switzerland is certainly a good place to start a SaaS company. Absolutely.
Thank you for your thoughts on this. So I now want to go back we talked about the timing and also sort of the prep work in terms of what milestones, what KPIs should you focus on. Now I want to talk about the outreach and the initial interest. So once you're ready, you say, hey, I am at the stage where it actually makes sense to start an M&A process. How do we get in touch with potential buyers? What happens at that stage and how do you actually find them?
Wow, that's a miracle. It's all magic. No, seriously. I mean, I always say, if in the bigger picture, these processes look pretty standardized, and they are, in fact. There's clear faces. in practical terms, they tend to turn out a bit chaotic every once in a while. I think that's sort of the challenge to manage that over time. So it all starts with, or I should also add that you need to be, fortunately, there's a good word now for this. You need to be agile. So, basically we can say, what do you need to get to let's say a substantiated discussion with a potential buyer? You need an information memorandum that basically covers all relevant aspects of your company, which products, which market, which client, etc., etc. You need a bit of a short version of that. Call it teaser, call it one-pager, something that you can use without disclosing the company's name to give a potential buyer a first impression of what you're actually talking about. You need, as a third element, a very sound financial model. It doesn't need to be super sophisticated, but it needs to show the drivers, and it needs to be rooted in the past and create some sort of a easy way to understand how the company will develop, what the drivers will be going forward. And basically the fourth element is a simple non-disclosure agreement. And you basically develop those in parallel as you start compiling a list of potential buyers. Why in parallel? Well, the reality is you don't do this, of course there's phases where you focus on one thing and on the other. But as you move with the, for instance, with the information memorandum, you start realizing what the real strategic rationale of a potential buyer could be. And that has obviously an impact on the question who you would contact, who could be on your shortlist. And talking about the shortlist, which is basically the entry point, I think you start with a hypothesis about who would be potential buyers, what the reasoning would be. They want access to the Swiss market and not an untypical motif, for instance, for service providers. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting market, hard to get in. Why not buy number 1, 2, 3 in this market and have the footprint? And then you start thinking who on the planet could have that strategic intent. Basically starting from that, you then try to narrow down your search in terms of geography, size. You start getting a feeling of the valuation of your company, mm-hmm. and you do basically some reverse engineering and say, how big would a potential buyer have to be in order to be able to finance such a transaction? It doesn't help if you get a lot of interest from people that don't have any money, right?
Sure.
You basically then iterate those, and at a given point in time, your investment story that you present in the information memorandum logically connects to the list of potential buyers that you have on your list, and that's when the adventure, the go-to-market, so to say, starts.
Is there any certain number that you would recommend to have on that short list, where you say we should at least reach out to 20 or 100 companies? Or what's your take there? Does that even make sense to have a fixed number in your head?
I wouldn't say it makes sense to have a fixed number. It depends a little bit on the conviction that you have about your rationale. So if you give you an example, if there's a company or there's 5 companies in a specific industry that are heavily consolidating the industry, buying local heroes in all the countries, then you probably don't need 50 of those to have a success in your process, because you have to assume that if you have a good story to tell, one of these guys will say, we're in the business of consolidating these players, so why not consolidate and acquire this player? If your story becomes a little bit more fuzzy, it's with any search process, then your list has to be longer. I could not give you an exact number, but I would say that when I create such lists and before we start, I think a reasonable number is between 50 and 100 names.
Yeah, got it.
You also have to assume that, one aspect here to add is if your search for whatever reason has some geographical constraints, let's say we only look for buyers in Europe, that limits the number then compared to a situation where you say, we have an IP case that could be interesting for any technology company starting in the US, Europe, Asia, then by nature, you have a much longer list.
Right.
You should also keep in mind that somehow you need to be able to then manage the work that comes with contacting the people. That's why I say there's also an upper limit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's often forgotten, I could imagine, where you just think, oh yeah, the more the better. But then you also have to interact with all of them if you reach out to them. And that's actually my next question. How do you actually reach out to them? Do you just send them a cold email? Do you try to leverage any introduction or any personal connections? How do you then send out and distribute the teaser, the one page that you created to the potential buyers?
I think that one important thing here to keep in mind is that the market has significantly changed in the last years. It's become more and more, professional, to the extent that people have no problem interacting with people they've never talked to before. So it's not a problem to enter such a discussion basically via email. It really depends on, it's really important that you try to identify the right person to talk to. So there's always in typical situations where you have also bigger companies to sell, you typically would talk to companies that have an M&A department, and their job is to look for interesting candidates. So they don't get confused just because somebody gets in contact with them. But you combine that very systematic approach, obviously, with some personal relations that you have, and I think through that you typically get to a very solid list of potential candidates.
And in that outreach, what role does the management, also the founders, in case of a startup, play? Do they actively send out those information, or would you recommend to go through a third party like you and use your services? What would you recommend there to actually do that initial outreach?
I would strongly recommend to use a third party for that, because you want to really keep confidentiality. And you cannot do that if you say, hello, I'm Silvan from company XYZ. Would you be interested in talking about potentially acquiring our company? So one reason to actually work with M&A advisors is to keep confidentiality very early on in the process. And I would always recommend to do that, and then get in contact with those based on a teaser document that doesn't even tell the name of the company.
Yeah.
Such a teaser document still needs to be precise enough. So you can't say, we're selling a software company in Europe. Would you be interested? That's just not precise enough. So you need to find the right balance between disclosing some interesting facts about your company and at the same time making sure that it's not too obvious who you're selling.
This talk is supported by Small PDF, the successful Swiss scale-up making PDF easy for over 1 billion people around the world since 2013. You may remember them from a previous podcast we hosted with their CEO, Dennis Just. Their mission is to make PDFs and life easy for people across the world, a mission made possible with their 90+ amazing employees across Zurich, Belgrade, and Barcelona. If you want to join this fast-growing Swiss scale-up, visit smallpdf.com/Swisspreneur and apply. And I think that's also, I don't want to dig too deep into that, but you also have a certain reputational risk, right? Because if your clients would hear that you're trying to sell the company, you might actually even lose some of your clients. So that confidentiality that you mentioned, that's really important to also be professional and don't have any rumors in the market.
That's true. That's true. And I think it also says something about the professionality of your company. If you're being professional with regards to confidentiality. On the other hand, I think you also don't need to be too paranoid about that. You know, I've hardly ever seen situations where I had the impression that somebody that was involved somehow abused this information to either, you know, hire people away from you or talk to your clients. You know, if you're talking to the right person, those guys are typically very professional, and realistically, they're also not too close to the operational business. So the M&A guy typically doesn't go for lunch with the HR department.
Yep.
So I would be professional, but not paranoid. I mean, at the end of the day, you want to get in contact with these people. And if you're not willing to also demonstrate some or give him some information about yourself, you know, people will just walk away and say, you know, this is just too clumsy. We every question we ask, they say, we'll tell you later. Okay.
I have one last question for the outreach. So now assume you made the outreach and you have the first initial interest from an M&A department or someone else. How do you then move from this initial outreach to a more intimate conversation where you can also disclose more details, more information, and also actually eventually enter negotiation part? How do you make that transition and move to the next phase?
Very practically speaking, once you have sent out this teaser, maybe you had an initial phone conversation because somebody has some, you know, first questions about it, then the first magic moment is basically that the potential buyer would sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then you provide actually the information memorandum. Not before that. And that's also the first time they actually formally know who the sellers are. Yeah. Following that, you get some add-on questions that can most of the time be handled or hopefully be handled by the M&A advisor because he or she understands well enough what they're actually selling. And so my role in that would then be to also qualify the interest. You know, you don't want to spend your time with people that are just tire kicking or want to, you know, are bored and think, you know, great, I have another information memorandum to read over the weekend. It's always interesting to know what other people do. So trying to qualify that is important. If you have the impression that there's some serious interest and there's also a match, you also want to rule out people that are interested for the wrong reasons. Doesn't happen very often, but you know, if somebody tells you it's great that you have 100% SaaS revenue, but actually you make 80% time and material and 20% SaaS revenue, it's probably the moment to clarify that. And that's then follow up with Q&A sessions with typically CEO, CTO, CFO, whoever is can basically give a good picture or answer some of the questions. And the goal is eventually to get potential buyers to demonstrate their interest in a meaningful way. That means you should ask then at a given point in time, and don't get too impatient about it, but you should ask for a non-binding offer, some sort of a written statement about why we are interested, how we envisage to do that, and what a potential transaction structure could look like, also including valuation parameters. And that's then the point where you can say, okay, now I've shown you the information memorandum. You came up with the first, basically, a declaration of interest, now we're talking. And then
now it's getting serious.
now it gets really serious, and it can also get very time intensive. I think people should keep that in mind, and you need to also be focused during that period, because sometimes you have 10, 12 parties that are interested, and if you put yourself in the shoes of the, let's say, CEO of a company, and you're going to the same questions over and over and over again, you start losing a little bit your enthusiasm. So make sure that you have some time, and make sure also it's also a two-way conversation. So ideally, you find out a lot about the motifs of the buyers, which then can be used again when you start negotiating the deal parameters. If you have no clue why they're buying, if you have no clue what they find so great about the company, you're just leaving potential on the table.
Yeah, and despite all these meetings and conversations taking place, you still have a business to run, right? So you have like 2 full-time jobs, basically, if you are in that process.
You still have your plan A, right?
Yep.
And I mean, it's, the process is exciting enough that you don't typically get too bored, but you should just be mentally prepared. If you have interested parties in Asia or in the US that just, they sit in California, and your call starts at 10 p.m. And if you then have no time because you're playing badminton, etc., it's not going to be helpful.
You also mentioned that there are certain points that you need to address in order to reach an agreement. So obviously there's the company valuation, the purchase price, maybe also an earnout period. So what are the important points from your experience that you really need to address in order to be able to eventually reach an agreement afterwards?
So I think that the foremost element, which is maybe doesn't even show up too much in deal documents eventually, is a common understanding of what you're trying to achieve. Because it has a lot of impact about how you structure the transaction, what the role of the management team is going to be going forward, et cetera, et cetera. And if you just avoid discussing that because everybody's just focused on the EBITDA multiple, then, it's just you leave out an important element, which is the foundation for most of the discussions that you have.
Yep.
And I think you should clarify that integration scenario from not only from an internal perspective, management, employees, etc., but also make sure that it also makes sense from a client perspective. Migrating clients from system A to system B, will they like that? If you are convinced that they will not like it, that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't do the transaction, but then maybe you should not be measured by how many clients you can migrate. For instance. So the integration scenario is the basis, and then there's basically 2 pillars. One is the commercial terms, and the other one is the legal terms. Commercial terms, I think it's very straightforward. It's what everybody talks about: valuations, payment structure, earnout structure, how is it measured, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. But there's also some important levers within legal terms, which probably don't get that much attention. It's about deal execution. Is it an asset deal? Is it a share deal? About liabilities, about representations and warranties. Something that's sometimes it's a bit of an annoying discussion for founders. We just built this up. Why do I have to guarantee all this? You're now buying the company. Well, if you have listed buyers or buyers that intend to IPO one of these days, you just have to make sure that they don't get, they don't get too much crap in their books over time. So they just want to make sure that all potential risks from a legal point of view, etc., are ruled out. And one last element, once you have basically agreed on commercial terms and basically legal terms, is to make sure that you have some tax advice in parallel. Usually tax is is not the most important element, obviously, but it can have some significant impact on how you structure the deal, etc., etc. And I think you should not wait too long to get also some tax advice at the table, because once the deal structure is set, it's very hard to go back and say, by the way, we found out that there's a tax disadvantage. Could we change that?
Yeah. Wow. I think these are really good tips. I mean, I don't want to go into detail here because I think we could fill a whole book together with all the details that you can discuss and negotiate here. But one thing I want to address is, what do you actually do if you have a different idea about the actual price? I would assume that this is probably almost always happening, that the founding team might have a different idea, too high or too little, about the price than potential buyers.
Well, it's sort of the starting point to create happiness in a pricing negotiation, because if both parties are totally happy, eventually that's the goal. But to start this conversation, that's usually not the case. I mean, if I buy a rock from you and you tell me it's 500 francs and I say, okay, I buy it for 500 francs, it's a typical situation where you say, stupid, I should have said 800 francs, right? So you need to make sure that you also create some room for both sides to sort of making sure that they have gotten the most out of the situation. It doesn't mean you have to poker too high. It's not a game. It's professionals negotiating amongst each others. But I'm just saying this conflict is sort of, it also creates the sort of happiness with the outcome at the end of the negotiation. Important things to keep in mind is really you need to create the win-win situation. So it's one thing to communicate, I want this, I want that, I want, I'm not going to move here. It's, if you need two parties to sign a document, you should also spend some time thinking about the situation of the other party. Not only the company, but also the people involved. What risks do they want to avoid? Where can you give them something that doesn't cost you a lot or that is not so important for you? And that's something that is basically nourished by extensive discussions with these parties before you even get to the point. That's why I said before, you need to make sure that you're also in a two-way conversation, and that you're not only answering questions, but you also make sure that you understand the company, the buying center, the people involved. And then you need to be, you need to keep some sort of flexibility and manage expectations. That's usually part of the M&A advisor as well. And that's also a reason why you should probably you shouldn't go there as a principal, but as an agent, because you always can go back and say, no, I need to talk to my client about your suggestion.
You can really play that good cop, bad cop thing also a bit. So that's super important to have someone external there who actually helps you to do it better at negotiations.
I think it's also important because sometimes you need to think about, you need to create this whole package. It's not just about the SaaS revenue model. There's a couple of other aspects which are important to keep in mind. And it's just a dialogue that needs to evolve over time. And I think it's hard for the principal to do that for time reasons, but also because there's no cushion. If I look in your face, you turn red, I know, I already see your reaction. And I want to make sure that I have sort of a wall, or at least maybe not a wall, but a cushion between the ultimate decision maker and the target.
Let's also quickly talk about due diligence. When and how does the due diligence process happen along the M&A process?
So the entry ticket for the due diligence, realistically, the de facto due diligence, it starts on the first minute you get in contact with a potential buyer. That's the reality. That's not what you mean with due diligence, but I think it's important to understand you're building a level of trust on both sides. So if you miss every deadline that you communicate in the run-up to the due diligence, It leaves the impression that those are probably not the most reliable guys you could ever imagine. So if they tell you it's 7, you better check twice. If you build up this reputation of being reliable and precise, it really helps. And the formal due diligence, i.e. legal due diligence, tax due diligence, commercial, HR, etc., usually starts after you have either a very sound non-binding offer, or even better, a signed term sheet, which can be much more detailed than just a non-binding offer.
And what are the documents that you need to have ready there? I know this probably also depends on case by case, but what are some of the general documents that you need to have ready and ideally probably prepared before you go into the process?
Absolutely. Well, some of the documents are actually prepared, or at least collected during the phase where you create the information memorandum, right? Yep. But let's say you need documents about your financials, about your team, about your product, about clients, and then some more formal stuff like social security, tax, etc., etc. And I mean, it would take up simply too much time to get too much into detail. But I would say, as a general rule, anything that is related to tax, financial, social security, etc., you should be able to show basically a complete set of documents for the last 3 to 5 years. And then if you talk about VAT, quarterly statements, yearly statements for the last 5 years, it's cumbersome. But if you think about entering such an M&A process, you should already start thinking also about your housekeeping, because if you then need to come up with all these documents, it's probably a bit too late.
And are there any red flags that you absolutely want to avoid here? Of course, I can think about missing documents, but maybe there's something else that you can share from your experience.
I cannot say that the red flags. I mean, don't lie. Don't fabricate documents. Nobody is perfect. That's the reality. But try to be as precise and as complete as possible. One element which people should not underestimate is the share history. That's probably something we should people know. Let people know. A buyer wants to understand the chain of ownership of 100% of the shares, and it needs to be documented in the right way. And a lot of companies don't have that, and it's usually pretty time intensive to get all the right legal documents. Sometimes you have to go back to shareholders that sold and say, we need an accession here, etc., etc. That takes some time. I wouldn't underestimate that. That's one of the classics people typically don't see.
Maybe also one situation that I can imagine is, I don't know how severe it is, but maybe you see, we don't have a legal action coming against us here in that case, but maybe that's something that might come up in the future. We just don't know yet. Maybe you have a risk of losing one of your biggest clients, but you're not sure yet. How proactively do you communicate these things, and how do you decide what you actually share with a potential buyer and what you don't share?
I would always suggest to bring that up in internal discussions, not with potential buyers, but in internal discussions very early on. Mm-hmm. So people should keep in mind also, when you think about the role of the M&A advisor, I'm like a doctor. If I don't understand the situation of your body, how you feel, etc., don't tell me your back doesn't ache if it aches. My diagnosis will always be wrong if I don't understand the situation. I don't have all the facts. And I think you should not be paranoid, because buyers are totally aware that there's business risks. There's always a biggest client, and yes, there's an end date to that contract. And if they're not totally stupid, they will ask you for a list of the, 10, 20, 30% biggest clients, maybe all of the clients, and they want to know what types of contract that they have. So you don't have to go to the client, to the buyer and say, they could terminate, and actually they could terminate. I think those are basically business risks. There's some other risks where it really depends also a little bit on sort of sometimes tax assessments or legal assessments. So one classic is that you have a lot of freelancers, and the contracts you have with the freelancers, they don't clearly regulate the IP rights. That's just something it's not going to fly in a due diligence. So you better make sure that you get your act together there as soon as possible. And eventually, it's also a little bit a question of the choreography. So maybe it's a bad idea to get up one morning and call the potential buyer and say, now we come to the list of the risks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's, if you set it up, and that's where the marketing part comes in, sell two plus points and combine that with a potential downside. Then, you have communicated that, and it's also a fair communication situation. Again, you don't have to be paranoid. Yes, the world could go under, but people know that. And last thought about that, you should use the due diligence also as a situation or an opportunity to disclose some of the maybe not so great aspects of your business. Because in the reps and warranties of a share purchase agreement, you will represent that some things are the way the buyer wants it to be. And if you negotiate that in a good way, you can always say that everything that you disclosed during the due diligence is excluded from that representation. So if you say, all the tables in our office are in good shape, you should tell them there's one table that's broken, and then you don't actually have to pay if it turns out that if they find out later that the table is broken. So you should also use the due diligence phase to proactively bring things at the table that you probably want to disclose anyway, to exclude them from reps and warranties, which is actually the whole point. I mean, at the end of the day, nobody's going to believe you that you're perfect anyway. So you might as well just say, yes, there's we have some damage there. There's a little risk there, but at the end, hopefully the upsides will outweigh the downsides.
Yeah, very good point.
In a serious way, this actually, you should not even be in a situation where you enter a due diligence if there's a chance that you're not going to survive.
So, of course, we will also have a question for Dr. Heiner. When are we actually ready to sign? When are we ready to sign a deal and execute it?
When there's a share purchase agreement, typically. That takes a few weeks to negotiate that. And it's as easy as that. Formally, that's the deliverable you need for an exit.
Yeah.
Typically.
And who's responsible for setting that up? Is it the buyer or the seller?
I would say in most of the cases, the sellers create a draft of a share purchase agreement, and then it goes back some iterations, sometimes very cumbersome, long nights, a lot of details, very legalistic to some extent. And at a given point in time, people start thinking that they're tired now and all the material points are sorted out. It's also sort of a give and take situation. And then you're ready to basically get an execution version and sign.
And how long does this process, the whole M&A process, as we've just outlined it now, usually take? Do you have an average duration of such a process that you work with?
I would say preparation before you go to the market, typically probably 3 months, sometimes a bit longer, because during the process you realize that you have to probably change some things, or you want to get to a certain milestone. And then once you have addressed the market, meaning gotten in contact with potential buyers, I would say a realistic time frame is between 3, 4, probably 6 months.
Yeah.
You should keep in mind that you need to keep a certain sense of urgency in the process. If you say, there's a long line of interested parties, but we have all the time in the world to negotiate with you. It's just not a very credible position.
What would be a better storyline there to sort of make that a bit more urgent?
Well, I think it's to communicate, maybe not too early, but at a given point in time, to start communicating what you're expecting from the process in terms of timing. So you say, by the end of Q1, by the end of March, we expect you to hand in a non-binding offer.
No.
Just to keep the process going.
No. Really drives the process.
So it could become, sort of it's like it's like buying something, anything. You could analyze yourself to death. So at a given point in time, you also have to make up your mind and say, well, that's good enough to at least get to the point where we reach the next milestone, i.e. a non-binding offer or a term sheet.
So now assume that the deal closed, but usually the deal even after signing is not fully done, right? So what happens after the closing? You still have some reps and warranties, as you mentioned before, and you also might have to stay on with the buyer a bit longer.
Most of the times, the people aspect of buying a company is important enough that a buyer would like the core people to continue for a while, or at least to make sure that there's a professional transition.
Yep.
And it could be anywhere from 1 year to probably 2.5 or 3 years. It's actually been less dramatic in recent periods, I think, but it really also depends on your business model. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a professional service firm, and it's really about all the talents you have. You don't have your own product, and you basically buy these people. And the other part is that you have your representations and warranties for a period of 18 months up to a couple of years, depending on what type of rep and warranty. That's usually not a dramatic thing, because if you've done your job, you should not get a problem with that. But still, it's sort of lingering around, and until you are to some extent on the hook for this during this period.
So I think now we covered the full process from how am I exit ready until the signing of the deal and beyond that. Are there any last tips or additional thoughts that you want to share with the audience today?
I think we covered a lot. Maybe one aspect that I would like to stress here is, please be realistic. I mean, there's a couple of studies in Switzerland now about how many companies actually achieve an exit, and the number is around 6%. So, you better always have a plan A, because it's not like the typical thing that happens. And in order to finish first, you have to first finish. So, I think, be realistic. To get to an exit is astonishing enough, and then to get to whatever fantasy valuation is even less probable.
Yeah,
I would say don't be too focused on the exit, especially in the early days. Always have your plan A, because it could always, for whatever reason, could be that process doesn't result in an exit. Timing is important. We talked about it. Don't be too early. Don't be too late. And if you enter the process, enjoy the ride. It's a roller coaster emotionally. Everybody you speak to would say, there's been times where I loved it. There's times where I hated it. I was convinced 15 times that the deal would fall apart. So you're always sort of oscillating between total euphoria and the deep depression, and you need to make sure that those emotions don't get too out of control, and just think that it's given that not very many people actually achieve an exit. It's sort of a unique experience and a great learning experience.
I feel like we could talk on for many more hours, but I think we're going to stop here. Heiner, thank you so much for sharing all these wonderful insights. It's been super impressive and also very insightful. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we're super excited to see what other companies you will help to sell in the future. I'm sure there are a few deals in the making.
There are. Thanks a lot, Silvan. It was great questions. Thanks a lot.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, you can support us by rating our show on Apple Podcasts. This way, we can reach an ever-growing number of aspiring entrepreneurs.